The bright lights of the New York City studio masked the rising tension on set. It was a live U.S. political panel show, the kind that draws millions each night. Former Trump spokesperson Karoline Leavitt sat at the edge of the glass table, her voice sharp, her posture stiff. Across from her sat Captain Ibrahim Traore, leader of Burkina Faso, invited to speak about African sovereignty and U.S. foreign policy. They weren't meant to clash. It was supposed to be a diplomatic debate. But it didn't stay that way. Midway through the segment, after Trot calmly challenged America's record in West Africa, Karoline leaned forward, her voice raised. "Sit down, boy," she said, her finger pointed like a weapon. The studio fell dead silent. Even the host's mouth hung open. Viewers at home gasped. Social media exploded. But Trop didn't flinch. He didn't yell. He didn't walk off. He simply looked at her deeply, silently, as if he was seeing something far older than her words. And then he spoke, but not the way anyone expected. The silence after her words was haunting. Karoline Leavitt had leaned back, arms folded, as if expecting to win. But Traore didn't move. Instead, he slowly stood up. Not in anger, not in rage. With the calm strength of a soldier who had seen war, a man who had buried brothers, a leader who carried the pain of a continent. He walked to the edge of the stage and looked out at the audience, silent, stunned, frozen in place. "I come from a place," he began softly, "where boys are forced to become men before they learn to dream." No one blinked. "You can call me boy on your stage," he said, now turning to Karoline. "But where I come from, boys carry nations on their backs. They fight so others don't starve. They lead because no one else will." Karoline's face dropped. Traore wasn't defending himself. He was speaking to something much deeper. The cameraman zoomed in. A tear was forming in the eyes of an elderly black woman in the front row. This wasn't politics anymore. This was truth, and America was listening. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the atmosphere grew heavy. Trop hadn't stopped speaking, but now his voice grew quieter, almost like he wasn't talking to Karoline anymore, but to everyone watching. "I buried my father under the open sky," he said. There were no cameras, no speeches, just dirt, silence, and the sound of my mother's grief. The audience was frozen. Some were holding their breath. "He was killed during a coup funded by outside powers," Traore continued, glancing briefly toward Karoline. His eyes were now shifting nervously. "So when you say, 'Sit down, boy,' do you mean the boy who watched his village burn? Do you mean the boy who studied under candlelight because the lights never came back on after colonialism left?" One of the American panelists, a decorated U.S. veteran, quietly put his hand over his heart. "You don't have to like me," Traore said, "but you will not erase me." A single clap came from the back of the studio. Then two. Then the room erupted. People stood, not in pity, but in honor. And Karoline, for the first time, she looked small. As the applause faded, Traore looked down briefly, as if choosing his next words with care. Then he raised his eyes to the crowd again. "You see a soldier?" he said. "But I was raised by a woman who worked with her bare hands." He paused. "My mother sold firewood. She walked miles in worn-out sandals so I could go to school. She hid her hunger so I wouldn't feel mine." The camera cut to Karoline. Her smirk had disappeared. She never said, "Sit down." She said, "Stand up, even when it hurts." A tear rolled down the cheek of a young girl in the front row. She whispered to her father, "He sounds like you." Traore's voice remained steady, but his eyes were wet. "So when someone like you calls me boy, you're not insulting me. You're insulting every mother who ever carried a nation on her back." The studio went silent again, but this time it was sacred. Even the host looked choked up. The insult Karoline had thrown had cracked. And from it, something sacred and beautiful was rising. America was watching. The silence was shattered by an unexpected voice. "He's right." Every eye turned. It was the U.S. Army veteran panelist, retired Colonel Jacob Whitmore, decorated, respected, white-haired. His voice trembled. "I served in Liberia. I've seen what boys like him face." The camera zoomed in. Shaking slightly, calling him boy. That's not debate. That's humiliation. Karoline shifted in her seat, her lips pressed tight. She looked small, not just in stature, but in presence. What you just said dishonors every brave man and woman I served with in Africa, he said. Traore turned to him, nodded with quiet respect. Colonel Whitmore stood and walked to Traore, extending his hand. Captain, thank you not just for defending your people, but for reminding us what true leadership looks like. The two men shook hands. The audience clapped again, this time with tears and respect in their eyes. Even those who had never heard of Burkina Faso now felt something deep, something raw, something true. And Karoline, she had started the show. With control, now the room didn't seem to hear her at all. Karoline's face flushed red. She could feel the energy of the room slip from her fingers like sand. She hadn't expected this. She thought calling him boy would silence him, maybe earn her applause, but it backfired. Oh, come on, she snapped suddenly, her voice sharp, desperate. Are we seriously pretending he's a saint now? The room recoiled. Few people gasped. Traore didn't move. Instead, he turned calmly to her and said, "It's not about sainthood. It's about humanity," Karoline stammered, looking at the host for help. But he just stared at her, stunned. "What's next?" She barked. "We apologize for being Americans." A young black student in the crowd stood up. "No," she said, voice cracking. "You apologize for being cruel." It wasn't just a response. It was a wound opening on live TV, and Karoline knew she was losing. She had underestimated Traore, and now her arrogance was unraveling. Live. As Traore sat back down, the camera zoomed in on his eyes. He wasn't angry. It was something far more dangerous to people like her. He was calm and deeply, completely unshaken. A heavy silence fell again. The young black student who had just stood up quietly took her seat, her eyes still locked on Karoline. You could feel the shift in the room. It wasn't just political anymore. It was personal. People weren't just watching a debate. They were watching a moment of truth. Karoline tried to recover. She forced a laugh and said, "Oh, come on, this is America. We're allowed to disagree," but the audience didn't laugh with her. The camera panned. Across the crowd, some had tears in their eyes. One woman clutched at her chest. A man in the back wiped his face with his sleeve. Traore leaned forward softly. "Disagreement is healthy," he said. "But disrespect kills the conversation." He looked right at her. "And if you kill the conversation, you kill understanding." The audience broke into applause again, this time slower, deeper, almost like a funeral hymn. Karoline sat frozen. Insult she launched was no longer echoing, was buried under something she didn't expect. It's human truth. As the studio began to settle, Traore gently reached into his inside pocket. He pulled out a folded, creased letter, the paper slightly torn at the edges. "This was written by my younger brother," he said quietly. 2 days before he was killed during a protest. Protesting for food. Now there was no applause, only silence. He carefully unfolded the letter. The host, now visibly emotional, leaned forward as if holding his breath. He wrote, "Big brother, if I die, promise me they won't forget." Why? Traore held the letter up to the light. Some people in the audience audibly gasped. A few wept. "So no," he said, voice steady but heavy. "I won't sit down because I carry the memory of those who were forced to kneel." Karoline blinked rapidly. Her hands trembled slightly under the table. For once she had no words. Outside the studio. On social media, the clip was already going viral. People across the country were sharing it with one word: watch. As Traore gently folded the letter back into his pocket, a strange quiet blanketed the room. Even the studio crew had stopped moving. No whispers. No laughter. No typing. Just breath held. The studio lights above flickered faintly. Someone in the control room was crying. The host finally spoke. "Captain Traore, is there anything you want to say to the American people watching right now?" He looked directly into the camera. "Yes," he said. "You don't need to know where Burkina Faso is to understand dignity. You just have to know what it feels like to be invisible." He leaned in. "I've never asked for pity. I ask for eyes that see." Karoline's jaw clenched. Her plan had collapsed. She wasn't the center of the show anymore. Traore was. It's not because he forced it, but because his truth was louder than her voice. Then something shocking happened. One of the camera operators put down his equipment and stepped onto the stage. He walked over to Traore, shook his hand, and whispered, "Thank you for reminding me what honor looks like." And that was just the beginning. The room was still frozen when a middle-aged black woman in the third row slowly stood up. She didn't ask permission. "I didn't come here to speak," she said softly, "but I need to say this." Everyone turned to her. "My son served in Afghanistan, came back in a box." Her voice cracked. He was called a boy, too, even in uniform. She looked at Traore with tears in her eyes. "When you spoke, it felt like my son stood up again." Gasps echoed across the room. The camera zoomed in. Traore gently nodded. No words, just deep shared pain. Karoline looked like she wanted to interrupt, but even she could feel it. This was not her moment anymore. The 10th woman added something that broke the room open. "America needs men like you, not loud mouths who talk over pain." The crowd erupted into standing applause. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was becoming something bigger, a reckoning. Karoline clenched her jaw. This was supposed to be her show, her moment, her political climb, and now she was invisible. "This is a setup," she hissed into her mic. "This isn't journalism, it's emotional theater." The host turned to her slowly, then removed his earpiece. "Karoline, the cameras are rolling. You made this moment. I just didn't expect it to speak back." She slammed her cue cards down and stood up. "Don't need this circus," she spat, then stormed off set, her heels echoing like gunshots across the floor. The audience didn't boo. They didn't cheer either. They just watched her go in silence. Now someone from the audience whispered what millions were thinking. She couldn't handle the truth. The camera panned to Traore, still seated, calm. "I didn't come here to shame her," he said quietly. "I came here to tell the truth." The host swallowed hard. "Well, the truth is sitting in your seat," and the world kept watching. As the commercial break rolled in the control room, producers scrambled, phones buzzed, emails flooded. A message came from the White House press team. 3 words. "We saw everything." Nobody knew what it meant, but everyone knew it mattered. Back on set, as the broadcast resumed, the host leaned in again. "Captain Traore, do you believe America can truly hear people like you?" Traore looked into the camera, not with anger, but with quiet strength. "Yes," he said, "but first, America has to listen when it's uncomfortable." Then he told a story, one that no one expected. "Last year, I visited a children's hospital in Chicago." He said a little girl there, just 8 years old, had drawn a flag with Burkina Faso's colors next to the U.S. flag. She said, "You're both fighting for us." The camera showed tears in the audience. "That child," he whispered, "understood more about unity than most grown leaders do." And that's when it hit viewers across the nation. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about heart. By the time the segment went viral, people were already pausing dinner. In kitchens, bedrooms, buses, and barbershops across the U.S., the video of Traore's response was playing on loop. Even families who didn't usually watch politics found themselves frozen in front of their screens. On Twitter, the hashtag #AgzaDownBoy flipped into a trending movement. Not in Karoline's favor, but as a moment off reflection. Clips were shared with captions like, "My dad called me crying. Said this reminded him of 1963. I showed this to my students today. Half the class couldn't stop crying." Back in the studio, Traore remained composed. He was offered a chance to respond to Karoline's walk-off. He politely declined. "She's not my enemy," he said. "She's a symptom. The real problem is deeper, and it's been growing in silence." A teenage boy watching from Atlanta tweeted, "I didn't know who Traore was an hour ago. Now I want to be like him." What was meant to be a takedown was turning into a national awakening. The host cleared his throat and asked the final in-studio question. "What does America need to hear right now, Captain?" Before Traore could speak, an elderly white man in military dress stood up from the audience, cane in hand, medals on his chest. "Before he answers," he said, voice trembling, "may I speak?" The camera zoomed in. "I served in Vietnam. I lost friends. I came home angry. I watched this country rip itself apart more than once." He pointed at Traore. But never in all my years did I see a man speak with so much grace after being disrespected like that. He turned toward the host, then the camera. America doesn't just owe him an apology. America owes him respect. There was no clapping, only tears. Even the host lowered his head. Traore slowly stood and shook the man's hand. Two soldiers from two different continents. One painful truth in common. That image would go viral too. Because sometimes the most powerful revolution starts with listening. Just when the broadcast was about to end, the host received a note. His eyes widened. Captain Traore, we have a surprise guest on video. The screen behind them lit up. A little girl appeared. The same child Traore had spoken about earlier from the Chicago hospital. Hi, Captain, she said, waving a red, white, green paper flag in her hand. You remembered me. The entire room melted. You said I was brave, she continued, her smile glowing. But tonight you were the bravest. The audience broke. Some wept openly. Even the host wiped his face with a tissue and whispered off mic, My daughter's the same age. Traore's lips trembled, his eyes glistening. He placed a hand over his heart. You give me strength, he said. You are the future I fight for. The girl nodded proudly, then said something no one expected. Next time someone says, sit down, boy, I'll tell them, stand up like Traore. The feed ended. The audience didn't just stand. They rose because this wasn't just television anymore. This was history. Hours after the broadcast, Ibrahim Traore sat quietly in his Washington hotel room. His phone had been buzzing nonstop. World leaders, celebrities, veterans, mothers, children, but it was the handwritten letter that made him stop breathing for a moment. It had been slid under his door from the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. It read, Dear Captain Traore, tonight you didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for every soul who was ever told to sit down, boy. We are preparing a permanent exhibition titled Dignity Under Fire. We would be honored to feature your words, your story, and the moment that changed the world. With deep respect, the board, he set the letter down and quietly whispered, Not for me, for all of them. Outside his window, crowds were gathering, not in protest, but to say thank you. The producers didn't expect it. But 1 week later, Karoline Leavitt walked back into the same studio where it all happened. No cameras, no makeup, no audience. Just a folded piece of paper in her hand. She asked the producer to deliver it to Traore. He opened it during a press conference. It read, I said, sit down, boy. And you stood taller than I've ever seen a man stand. I was wrong. I don't expect forgiveness. But I do hope your people and my daughter grow up in a world where they learn from your strength, not my ignorance. The room fell silent. In Traore, he looked up from the note and said, We don't heal through silence. We heal through courage. And she just showed some. From that day forward, even his sharpest critics began calling him by a new name, the man who made America listen. Weeks passed, the show returned. The world moved on. But in the studio, one thing never changed. A single, empty chair placed in the center of the stage where Traore once sat. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't explained. But everyone knew what it meant. It meant dignity. It meant courage. It meant that one man from Burkina Faso walked into a storm and came out a symbol of peace. Later that year, Traore spoke at the United Nations. But it wasn't his speech that broke the internet. It was the moment he held up a small handmade American flag drawn by the 8-year-old girl who once smiled at him through a hospital screen. Said, This flag was given to me by a child who believed. I stood for something good. That means more than any medal. Then he looked into the camera and said, America, don't just clap. Change. If this story moved you, if you felt that lump in your throat, then drop a comment right now. Let me know what part touched you the most, and if you believe dignity, grace, and truth still matter. Subscribe to this channel because here we tell stories that make you feel, stories that matter. Thank you for watching, and never sit down when it's time to.